Welcome to Amerixa Daily. The super revolutionaries who want Iran to reject peace. I want you to imagine something that sounds completely backwards. A country is under crushing pressure. Its economy is unstable. Its currency has been battered for years. It has faced sanctions, international isolation, military strikes, internal political tension, and the constant threat of escalation with the United States and Israel. Most governments in that situation would desperately want stability. They would want negotiations. Relief. A way out. But inside Iran right now, one of the loudest and fastest growing political factions is fighting against peace talks with America. Not quietly. Not behind closed doors. Publicly. Aggressively. And here's the strange part. These people aren't anti-government rebels trying to overthrow the Islamic Republic. They are some of its most loyal supporters. Think about that for a moment. A faction inside the system believes the government becomes weaker when it negotiates peace. Even more bizarre. Some of these hardliners believe the United States has already proven something terrifying, that Iran's leaders can be attacked, sanctioned, isolated, even assassinated, and still parts of the government will continue trying to negotiate. To them, that is humiliation. Now let's put this into perspective. Iran is a nation of nearly 90 million people. It sits at the center of one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. A single disruption in the Persian Gulf can shake global oil prices overnight. A breakdown in negotiations between Iran and the United States can ripple through financial markets, military alliances, shipping routes, energy costs, even elections in other countries, and yet, despite all of that pressure, this ultra-hardline movement known as the Endurance Front, or as critics call them, the super revolutionaries, argues that compromise itself is the danger. Not war. Not sanctions. Not isolation. Compromise. Beat. That sounds irrational at first. But the deeper you look, the more unsettling it becomes. Because these men are not operating according to normal political logic. They believe they are defending something sacred. Something eternal. And once you understand the worldview driving them, the entire conflict inside Iran starts to look less like a political disagreement, and more like a battle over reality itself. So let's start with the obvious question. Why would anyone reject peace when the alternative could be catastrophe? The obvious answer, and why it's wrong. The simple explanation is easy. Most people look at this situation and say, these are just extremists. Case closed. They're radicals. Ideologues. Fanatics who hate the West so much they would rather suffer than compromise. And yes, there's truth in that. But that explanation is also incomplete. Because if this movement were truly fringe and powerless, nobody would care. The Iranian government wouldn't be trying to appease them. Negotiators wouldn't include their allies in talks. Their speeches wouldn't dominate state-aligned media. And foreign governments certainly wouldn't worry about them sabotaging diplomacy. So clearly, something deeper is happening. Here's the mistake most outsiders make. They assume Iran's political system works like a normal government. One leader. One strategy. One unified objective. But that's not how the Islamic Republic was designed. Iran's system is more like overlapping power centers competing with each other while all claiming loyalty to the same revolution. Religious authorities. Military factions. Parliamentary blocs. Media institutions. Clerical networks. Security elites. And inside this structure, legitimacy matters more than almost anything else. Think about it like this. In many countries, politicians gain power by promising prosperity. In revolutionary systems, people gain power by proving ideological purity. That's a completely different game. Because once politics becomes tied to sacred identity, compromise stops looking practical, and starts looking sinful. Here's where it gets fascinating. The super-revolutionaries don't believe negotiations fail because America cannot be trusted. They believe negotiations fail because negotiating itself corrupts the revolution. That's the real divide. To them, resistance is not a strategy. It is the identity of the Islamic Republic. Remove the resistance, and the entire ideological foundation begins to crack. Beat. And suddenly, the paradox changes. This isn't a group risking Iran's survival because they're irrational. In their minds, they are trying to save Iran's soul. And that distinction changes everything. Because now the question becomes far more dangerous. What happens when survival and ideology stop pointing in the same direction? 3. Layer by layer reveal. Layer 1, the revolution feeds itself. Let's go one layer deeper. At first glance, the super-revolutionaries look like outsiders challenging the Iranian establishment. But here's the twist. They are deeply embedded inside it. Their allies exist in parliament, in religious institutions, in state media, in universities, in clerical networks, even inside negotiation teams. Think about that for a moment. The people attacking diplomacy are sometimes sitting inside the diplomatic process itself. That sounds absurd. But it makes sense once you understand how revolutionary systems survive. Because in Iran, power doesn't only come from elections or public popularity. It comes from revolutionary legitimacy. Who is seen as the true defender of the revolution? Who appears most loyal? Who refuses compromise the longest? And after years of conflict with the West, these hardliners built an identity around permanent resistance. That identity became political capital. Now imagine what happens if peace suddenly works. If sanctions ease. If relations stabilize. If younger Iranians begin asking why decades of confrontation were necessary in the first place. Suddenly, the people whose entire identity depends on resistance risk becoming irrelevant. Here's the left pocket right pocket problem. The Islamic Republic created institutions designed to protect the revolution. Over time, those institutions created factions whose power depends on the continuation of revolutionary tension. In other words, the system produced forces that now pressure the system itself. The revolution feeds its own hardest defenders. And those defenders become powerful enough to resist change from within. Beat. That's why this conflict feels so strange from the outside. Because Iran isn't simply negotiating with America. It's negotiating with itself. Layer 2, the citizens are pulled into both sides. Now let's go even deeper. Because this story isn't just about elites or clerics. Ordinary people are trapped inside this contradiction too. On one side, millions of Iranians desperately want economic relief. Inflation has crushed savings. Young people struggle to find stable work. Many educated professionals have emigrated. Families worry constantly about prices, instability, and the future. So naturally, many people hope negotiations with the United States could improve life. But here's the complication. Years of sanctions, conflict, assassinations, and foreign pressure also created a siege mentality in parts of society. Especially among younger ideological supporters of the regime. Some grew up hearing that the West wants to destroy Iran no matter what concessions it makes. Then they watched military strikes. Economic warfare. Targeted killings. International isolation. And to them, that experience reinforced the hardliners' message. See? Resistance was necessary all along. Here's where it gets psychologically powerful. Pressure from outside Iran sometimes strengthens the exact factions the outside world hopes to weaken. Because fear creates solidarity. Especially in revolutionary states. Think about wartime psychology. When people feel attacked, they often rally around the most uncompromising voices. Not the moderates. Not the negotiators. The fighters and the super-revolutionaries understand this perfectly. That's why they organize rallies. Why they dominate emotionally charged media messaging. Why they frame negotiations as humiliation rather than diplomacy. They're fighting a battle over perception. Over identity. Over emotional loyalty. And in moments of national trauma, emotional narratives can become stronger than economic logic. Beat. That's the terrifying part. Because once politics becomes existential, compromise starts feeling like betrayal. Layer 3, the human story. Now let's bring this down to one person. Imagine a 24-year-old university graduate in Tehran. Let's call him Reza. Reza grew up during sanctions. He watched prices rise year after year. His parents worried constantly about money. His older cousin emigrated to Europe because he saw no future inside Iran. Reza wants stability. He wants opportunity. He wants a normal life. But he also grew up surrounded by another message. That Iran is under siege. That foreign powers want to dismantle the country. That resistance is patriotic. Then conflict escalates. Bombings happen. Iranian commanders are killed. State television fills with images of mourning crowds and speeches about sacrifice. And suddenly, the emotional atmosphere changes. Now imagine hearing politicians argue that negotiating with America after all this suffering would mean surrendering to the very people responsible for attacking your country. For someone like Reza, the issue stops being abstract geopolitics. It becomes emotional identity. National dignity. Historical memory. That's how movements like the Endurance Front grow stronger. Not necessarily because everyone agrees with them economically, but because they speak the language of certainty during moments of fear. And certainty is incredibly powerful. Especially when societies feel unstable. Beat. This is why outsiders often misunderstand ideological movements. They assume support comes from ignorance. Sometimes it comes from meaning. From belonging. From the feeling that sacrifice has purpose. And that's much harder to defeat than a political argument. 4. The mind shift conclusion. So what's the real lesson here? At first, this story looks like a simple political conflict. Hardliners versus moderates. War versus peace. But that's not actually what's happening. The deeper reality is much stranger. The super-revolutionaries believe resistance itself is the foundation of the Islamic Republic. Not a temporary policy. Not a negotiation tactic. The foundation. And if that foundation disappears, they fear the entire system could slowly lose its meaning. Here's the mind shift. Most people assume governments primarily exist to maximize prosperity and stability. But revolutionary governments often prioritize legitimacy first. Identity first. Ideology first. Because once a state is built on a revolutionary story, abandoning that story can feel existential. Even if compromise might improve everyday life. That's why this conflict matters far beyond Iran. Because versions of this paradox appear all over the world. Movements that gain power through struggle often become dependent on struggle. Leaders who rise through resistance sometimes fear peace more than conflict. And systems built around permanent enemies can begin to need those enemies in order to justify themselves. Think about that for a moment. Beat. Sometimes the greatest threat to a revolutionary movement is not defeat. It's normalization. Because once people experience ordinary life, they begin asking extraordinary questions. Questions about sacrifice. About power. About whether decades of conflict were truly necessary. And that is what makes this moment inside Iran so dangerous. Not simply the negotiations with America. But the deeper battle over what the Islamic Republic is supposed to become next. A nation that survives through resistance? Or a nation that transforms through compromise? And the answer to that question may shape the Middle East for decades. Because once you realize that some political systems fear peace more than war, you start seeing global conflicts very differently. You stop asking only, who wants power? And you begin asking the far more important question. Who needs the conflict itself to survive?